Hello history fans and welcome back to the podcast that helps you learn a little bit of history. Now, it's Women's History Month and we are on the final week, so I expect you to know this intro by heart. It's Women's History Month, so each week I'll be doing a roundup of the week's worth of women I've been talking about online. For those of you just listening, I'll post the short video I posted on Instagram and TikTok, and then we'll expand maybe a little bit. So if you're listening, don't forget to follow the podcast and download to listen on the go. And if you're watching, please do subscribe and leave a comment letting me know one of your favourite women from history, or who was someone that I have shared with you that maybe you didn't know about before, or maybe you found inspirational. The first video this week was a collaboration with Steph, who you will find on Instagram as Adventuring Archaeologist. It's day 25 of 31 Days of Women's History, and today we're talking about one of Steph's favourite women from history, Queen Mavia.
Queen Mavia is one of my favourite female historical figures because not only did she successfully negotiate peace with the Romans and possibly rule in her own right for 50 years, but she's also one of the key historical figures who helped to shape late antique Arab identity.
Mavia was the warrior queen who led the tribes of Syria and Jordan in a successful revolt against Rome in the year 378. The reasons for it aren't really known, but it's thought that Rome were probably demanding her men for their army.
Although she's often known as the Queen of Syria, this isn't 100% accurate, as she actually ruled a group of various Arab tribes in the region. Some sources refer to her as Mavia of Tanukh, as that was the main tribe which she was the leader of, while the Latin sources refer to her as Mavia, Queen of the Saracens.
After her successful revolt, she is then able to dictate negotiations, and she makes Moses a bishop of her people, admiring him for his devotion to God, but also wanting a spiritual leader who followed the Nicene Christianity rather than that of Rome or Byzantium.
That, along with her daughter marrying a Roman commander called Victor, helped to seal peace between Mavia and the Romans. Later, her troops would help defend Constantinople for the Romans against the invading Goths.
It's thought that she ruled until 425 CE, but nothing is known of her death. Through history, she's compared to other warrior queens, like Queen Zenobia, but unlike the other queens, she won against Rome.
Queen Mavia is considered by some to be the matriarch of Christian Arabia, as she used her skills in diplomacy and battle prowess to protect Arab identity both in spite of and against Roman hegemony. She is one of numerous Arab women who during the late antiquity used their female power to not only lead their people but also to lay the foundations for the rise of Islam. Although we don't know how her story ends, perhaps this is a good thing. Mavia, unlike other female warriors who end their lives with defeat on the horizon, disappears quietly into history, perhaps earning the peace she so desperately deserves after sacrificing so much in defense of her people.
When Steph and I were discussing Mavia, a lot came up about her use of religion and the fact that the actions she takes aren't because she's religious, but because they were good strategic political movements. But things get twisted by the ecclesiastical style histories that she tends to pop up in. She negotiated peace with the Romans and manages to hold them off for half a century, and the most important part of her story is that she was undefeated against the Romans. Then we have a video with May, who's on Instagram as history_May. It's day 26 of 31 Days of Women's History, and today we're talking about one of May's favourite women from history, Hurrem Sultan. So why is she one of your favourites?
Hurrem Sultan is one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, but what fascinates me even more is her life story. She was captured during a slave raid, then entered the Ottoman harem, rose through the ranks, and became the wife of the Sultan.
She was the first ever woman to receive the title of Haseki Sultan. The Emperor Suleiman not only freed her from slavery, but also elevated her from favourite consort to queen consort.
With this position, Hurrem had an active part in politics. She not only advised the Sultan, but also wrote diplomatic letters and supported major public works.
It's an interesting example of women holding power, even in patriarchal societies.
Yes, and Hurrem's relationship with Suleiman was quite special. We still have letters they wrote to each other, and you can just see how much Suleiman loved her. She must have been an exceptional woman.
She was initially dealt quite the unfortunate set of cards, but made the best of her situation and has become an inspiration. Hurrem, also called Roxolana or Roxolana, was a very interesting woman to hear about, and I don't have much to expand on for her, but she's an extremely powerful woman of the Ottoman Empire, and there's a link in the description if you want to read more about her. Next, we have B, who you probably know on Instagram as Chaos on Olympus, or you'll know her as the best-selling author of Girl, Goddess, Queen. It's day 27 of 31 Days of Women's History, and today we're talking about one of B's favourite women from history, Telasilla.
I love Telasilla, in part because she's one of those really fabulous historical figures for whom history and myths sort of merge, and we don't know what's 100% true, but some of the stories we do have are really fun.
Telasilla of Argos was a Greek lyric poet living in the 5th century BCE, and was named one of the 9 great female poets of ancient Greece.
It's said that she was really ill when she was younger, so they visited an oracle, and the oracle said that she should devote her life to the muses, and so she did. She dedicated herself to music and poetry, and wrote a lot of poetry about Artemis and Apollo specifically.
Soon her health was restored, and her fame as a lyric poet grew and grew, with writers and artists of the time constantly quoting her.
And this is where it gets really fun, because in addition to being this amazing poet and musician, which is already really fascinating for a woman in the ancient world, she's also said to be involved with driving the Spartan forces out when they tried to invade in about 494 to 493 BC.
As the Spartans were taking the grove of Argos, killing the men who had taken refuge in its sacred grove, and were beginning to march on the city of Argos, Telasilla decided to gather the women, the young and the old, who had been left in the city, and raise a sort of army who were ready to defend themselves.
The validity of this story and her involvement in it is questioned, but I think it's just really fun that this even exists in the consciousness of antiquity. You know, this isn't a story about mythological Amazons, this is a real person, and it kind of pairs up with other stories that we have of women lining the rooftops throwing tiles at invaders. There are like numerous stories from this sort of time period of women defending themselves, and this is against Spartan invaders. And just in general, I think we could all do with some more stories about poets that turn into fierce warriors to defend against the Spartans.
Telasilla of Argos is such an interesting character, and as with the past few videos, I think we did a very good job of summing up her story again, so I've not got loads to expand on this week. There's a link in the description to read more, but something I find interesting is that there's an ancient oracle told by a Pythian priestess that said, "But when the time shall come that the female conquers in battle, driving away the male, and wins great glory in Argos, then many wives of the Argives shall tear both cheeks in their mourning." And of course it said that the oracle was referring to Telasilla, the poet who led Argos through the military crisis and then helped to rebuild the city. We're coming very close to the end now with Hannah, who you'll find on Instagram with Hannah_Parker_. It's day 28 of 31 Days of Women's History, and today we're talking about one of Han's favourite women from history, Zenobia.
Zenobia was one of several queens who led revolts against the Roman Empire. She was a patron of the arts, transforming Palmyra into a hub of learning. She spoke several languages, and it's even rumoured that she claimed descendants of Cleopatra, another highly educated Eastern queen who threatened Rome's power.
Zenobia enters our history books in the year 240 and becomes queen in 255 after her marriage to King Odonact.
She went on campaigns with her husband, and after his assassination, she became the sole ruler, leading several expansion-driven military expeditions from Asia Minor to Egypt.
Her husband was a client king with power and titles bestowed upon him by the Emperor Gallienus. Whilst technically a Roman, in practice he ruled the Roman Near East, and after his mysterious death, Zenobia claimed new lands and declared independence from Rome.
Now, as queen of a thriving and growing empire, Zenobia appears to have been left to her own devices by the Emperor Claudius II. But unfortunately for her, all that would change when Aurelian gained power.
The Romans pushed her forces out of Alexandria and Antioch, and eventually she had to flee when the Romans besieged Palmyra, but she was captured before she could escape.
Nobody knows what happened to Zenobia, but one theory is that she took her own life rather than being paraded around Rome as a trophy in Aurelian's triumphal procession.
Zenobia is another warrior woman who does not give in to the Romans. Once again, there's a link in the description, but this is from the Historia Augusta, a collection of Roman biographies from 117 to 284. Zenobia is perhaps the only female whose superior genius broke through the servile indolence imposed on her sex by the climate and manners of Asia. She claimed her descent from the Macedonian king of Egypt, equalled in beauty her ancestor Cleopatra, and far surpasses that princess in chastity and valour. Zenobia was esteemed the most lovely as well as the most heroic of her sex. She was of dark complexion, her teeth were of pearly whiteness, and her large black eyes sparkled with uncommon fire, tempered by the most attractive sweetness. Her voice was strong and harmonious. Her manly understanding was strengthened and adorned by study. She was not ignorant of the Latin tongue, but possessed in equal perfection the Greek, the Syriac, and Egyptian languages. She had drawn up for her own use an epitome of Oriental history, and familiarly compared the beauties of Homer and Plato under the tuition of the sublime Longinus. That's a quote from ancient history about someone from ancient history. There you go. Next we have Rosie, who's History with Rosie on Instagram. It's day 29 of 31 Days of Women's History, and today we're talking about one of Rosie's favourite women from history, Mary Shelley.
One of my favourite women from history is Mary Shelley, who famously wrote the novel Frankenstein, which is often credited as the first ever sci-fi novel.
It's said that Mary educated herself using her father's extensive library and was constantly surrounded by his intellectual friends, like William Wordsworth.
Mary Shelley has only recently begun to be recognised for her own achievements. When she was alive, she was often overshadowed by her husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and many thought he actually wrote Frankenstein. He was the editor on the book, but actually, when looking back at notes, he wasn't a very good editor, and he didn't really help write the book at all.
She also edited the book herself in 1831 after she had suffered many losses, and she realised that her view on Victor Frankenstein's victimisation had changed.
Mary Shelley's mother was the famous feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, who died just 11 days after Mary's birth. The woman that Mary's father remarried to, Mary didn't like. So at the age of just 17, Mary and her stepsister, Claire Clairmont, who famously had a child with Lord Byron, ran away to France.
It was after their return from France that Mary fell pregnant, and then the pair began to be ostracised, as well as constantly in debt after the death of their prematurely born daughter.
It was in 1816, when staying with Lord Byron at Lake Geneva, that she came up with the idea for Frankenstein. Although Mary was mostly known for her efforts to help publish her husband's work and Frankenstein, actually she wrote a great number of books, which are all really respected in the literary world, so if you ever get a chance to check them out, then they're highly recommended. Mary Shelley was a political radical throughout her life, challenging even the views of her husband and her father in her literary works, and it was even said that she might have been a supporter of the LGBT community, helping two female friends get married. Despite the hardships faced in her life, Mary Shelley worked hard and was revolutionary ahead of her time.
Mary would have grown up with some good education thanks to her parents' friends, her mother being the OG feminist, and her father, William Godwin. I wanted to say Godwinson then, that's Harold. He belonged to elite social circles of artists, scientists and politicians, and Frankenstein's creation is sort of as famed as the book itself. In 1816, Mary, her husband Percy, Lord Byron the poet and the physician John Polidori went to Switzerland, and after reading a book of spooky stories together, they decided that they would have a ghost story writing competition. Over that summer, Mary came up with the concept of Frankenstein, and John wrote The Vampire, which was the influential pre-Dracula vampire story. What a cool creation story for them both. For the penultimate day, I posted some pictures of suffragettes. Of course, there's too many to name and countless women to thank in the ongoing efforts for women's rights, but here's a few of the original suffragettes. The first picture was Emmeline Pankhurst with her daughters Christabel, Sylvia and Adela, and the group of women in Manchester who founded the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903. Emily Davison, who stepped in front of the King's Horse in 1913. Millicent Fawcett, who improved women's education. Lydia Becker, who published the Women's Suffrage Journal. Edith Garrod, one of the first ever female martial arts instructors who trained the WSPU bodyguards and other suffragettes in self-defence. Leonora Cohen, Emmeline's bodyguard, who smashed the display case of the crown jewels in the Tower of London, and who contributed to the second wave of feminism in the 1970s. Kitty Marion, the arsonist actress, guilty of 5 acts of arson, but was actually only caught at the grandstand at Hurst Park Racecourse, not when she was causing a fire, I believe. Ada Flatman, who opened the first Votes for Women shop in Liverpool that raised funds so suffragettes could campaign nationally. Flora Drummond, the General, the organiser of the Suffragettes. Muriel Matters, who chained herself to the Ladies' Gallery in the House of Commons with Violet Tillard and Helen Fox. And with that list of suffragette names, we have come to the last day. It's the last day of 31 Days of Women's History for Women's History Month, and this video is for the ordinary women. It seems that to be a strong woman or a good feminist, you have to be brave, brilliant, fantastic, and always fighting to be powerful. But there's also power in just being a woman. So this last day is for those women that history may have forgotten. Claudia Severa, who wrote a birthday invitation to her friend Sulpicia Lepidina in ancient Roman-occupied Britain. Medieval washerwomen who passed the time sharing news and gossip with each other whilst doing their quite labour-heavy work. The Tudor women who couldn't afford or couldn't find medical help, so would run into church and tie up their shoelaces as it was believed to help them survive childbirth. Margaret Parsons, a servant who possibly lived something like this in 1551, who helped to plough a 7-acre field. Whose story helped us to discover that in 1500, 40% of agricultural work was done by women. The Victorian women who started working in factories making clothes or shoes or even food, so they didn't have to just keep being servants to richer households. Mary Smith, a knocker-upper who charged 6 pence a week to wake people up in East London in the late 1800s. And countless others who have lived and worked as women who history has unfortunately forgotten. As much as I love an inspirational woman to look up to, ordinary lives like these are important stories to tell too, because it shows us that there is power in just being a woman. You don't always have to fight for things, you don't always have to be brave and powerful. You can just be an ordinary woman. I don't have anything else to add. Past me summed that up pretty nicely, I think. So that concludes the last week of Women's History Month. Wow, what a lot of women we have spoken about. Thank you to all the historians who did the videos with me. And thank you for listening for so long. I do hope you enjoyed. If you did and you're watching, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening, please do follow the podcast and give me as many stars as you think I deserve. Come on, it's Women's History Month. 5 stars. Thanks again. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye. Suffragettes sing, we're gonna do this thing.